It comes to light that Lewis Hamilton missed the podium at Silverstone in front of his home crowd due to an engine failure in his SF-25. Was it just a coincidence? Want to know the real reason? This video is for you. What if the real story of Silverstone was never about a pit stop gone wrong, but about something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable? Imagine for a moment that Ferrari didn't simply lose the podium because of a strategic miscalculation, or even because of a risky tire call gone sideways. What if they allowed it to slip away, consciously, deliberately, with eyes wide open? What if the most pivotal moment of the race wasn't the precise second Lewis Hamilton was ordered to box, but the invisible silence that swallowed the airwaves before that call, the kind of silence that doesn't just hint at confusion but exposes something far more unsettling, a lack of unity, a fracture behind the scenes that no tire compound or pit strategy could ever repair? As fans focused on lap 42, as the soft slicks were bolted onto Hamilton's car and the crowd roared with anticipation or dread, something else, quieter, more insidious, was unfolding in the garage. Before the instruction came, Hamilton had done what any experienced driver would do. He reached out, calmly, respectfully. He asked for clarity. He asked about the weather radar, subtly referencing the growing dampness he could feel creeping through the chassis. He probed for reassurance about the grip, inquiring about the numbers, the strategy, the data he couldn't see but assumed they had. And yet, in those crucial seconds, he was met not with over-communication, not with the usual chorus of engineers analyzing possibilities, but with silence. A vacuum. An absence so loud it felt almost intentional. And then suddenly, out of that void came a single unflinching directive: box now. There was no conversation. No collaboration. No trace of hesitation in the tone. Just a cold, sterile command. And Lewis obeyed. Because that's what drivers do when they're in the cockpit, they trust. But what if that trust was misplaced? What if, when you rewind the footage, when you overlay the tire degradation graphs, radar models, and sector deltas, you start to see not chaos, but design? Nico Hülkenberg, driving for Haas, didn't pit that lap. He stayed out. He danced on the edge of the wet line, yes, but he held his ground. And for that one extra lap, he reaped the reward. Ferrari's race didn't unravel from performance issues, or a tire cliff, or a misread weather pattern. It came undone because they blinked first. They surrendered initiative. They relinquished control, not to the rain, not to Red Bull or McLaren, but to fear, to uncertainty, to something happening behind the pit wall that no one is quite willing to explain. Hamilton later described the experience as building a wall, stone by stone, lap by lap, only to be handed the sledgehammer and told to destroy it himself. That metaphor wasn't poetic flourish. It was a thinly veiled indictment. Because there's no other way to describe a team who asked their 7-time world champion to take on the storm without a compass, without visibility, and without conviction. Ferrari lost GPS tracking of Hamilton's car after lap 10. That's a fact now confirmed by internal reports and whispers from sources inside the paddock. They were navigating blind, unable to pinpoint his exact position on the circuit. The engineers, some of the finest minds in motorsport, were reduced to relying on outdated deltas, estimated sector splits, and predictive models that assumed ideal conditions. But Silverstone wasn't offering ideal conditions. It was a chessboard soaked in chaos, and Ferrari was playing without half its pieces. In that context, Hamilton wasn't just driving against Lando Norris or George Russell. He was driving against the very system designed to support him. A system operating in shadows, making instinctive calls under pressure, and failing to communicate why those calls even made sense. That's not racing. That's roulette. And for a driver like Lewis, who has spent his entire career crafting victory through precision, through data, through intimate synergy with his team, that kind of uncertainty isn't just uncomfortable. It's corrosive. So when Hamilton referred to the car as snappy, people assumed he meant twitchy, loose, unpredictable. But that wasn't a setup complaint, it was a coded message. A warning. A signal. He wasn't just describing the handling. He was questioning the behavior of the machine beneath him, as if it were no longer responding to his inputs in ways that made logical sense. As if the car itself had turned temperamental, uncooperative, almost willful in its defiance. And when the telemetry was finally dissected, it revealed the truth that words couldn't. Sector 2, post-pit stop, showed a dramatic increase in rear-end instability, up 18% compared to the control data from Friday's long-run simulations. That's not a marginal shift. That's a red flag. That's not something you blame on track evolution or wind direction. That's something you feel in your spine. That's the kind of anomaly that forces a driver to recalibrate everything: braking zones, throttle timing, corner entry, exit acceleration. It's not just driving anymore. It's surviving. And the question lingers: why did it happen? Was it tire pressure? Ride height? A differential tweak that didn't register? Or something else entirely? Something premeditated? Something like a setup compromise made earlier in the weekend, one that was supposed to favor dry conditions but left Hamilton defenseless in the wet? Or maybe even a quiet internal split, a disagreement within the garage about who the weekend should be built around, Charles or Lewis. A split that ultimately left the car in a no-man's land of balance, tailored for neither. Because what unfolded at Silverstone wasn't just a tactical misstep or an engineering glitch. It was a reflection of something far more dangerous in a championship-caliber team: dissonance. A lack of harmony. And in Formula One, when the rhythm between driver and team collapses, when the calls start to come from a place of panic instead of precision, when silence becomes louder than strategy, that's when races are lost. Not just points, not just podiums, but belief. And belief, once shattered, is the hardest thing to rebuild. And this is where the story plunges into the shadows, far deeper than just a tactical disagreement or a misjudged setup. All across the paddock, subtle murmurs evolved into murmured warnings, glances exchanged behind pit wall monitors, cryptic comments between engineers under their breath. By mid-weekend, the rumor had solidified into something more sinister. Lewis Hamilton had overridden Ferrari's internal consensus. He had demanded a radically different configuration. Not just a tweak or a fine-tune, but an entire rethinking of the car's core behavior. He called for softer rear compounds that would degrade faster but offer temporary traction supremacy, a razor-thin ride height designed for pinpoint aerodynamics but dangerously unforgiving on a damp surface, and a brake migration heavily biased toward the front, ideal for ultralate braking, but risky, borderline reckless, on corner entry when the conditions are unpredictable. Ferrari, under pressure and desperate for a breakthrough moment, relented. Against their better judgment, they let him steer the ship. They granted his demands, gave him the tools to attempt something heroic. But what they did next spoke volumes. Not in action, but in absence. When the grip began to falter, when the car's balance tipped from bold to treacherous, they didn't pull him back. They didn't caution him. They didn't intervene with analytics or recalibrate with real-time corrections. They stood still. They said nothing. They observed. Almost like they were waiting. Waiting for the data to confirm their doubts. Waiting for his judgment to be punished. And so they left him, utterly alone. Alone in a machine whose attitude had turned venomous. Alone on a rain-slicked track where every apex demanded trust in machinery that no longer behaved like a partner, but more like a wild card. Alone with a pit wall that fell silent, as if the frequency had been cut off intentionally. The silence wasn't technical. It was surgical. Then came lap 35, what fans will remember as a moment of raw aggression and brilliance. Hamilton lunged on Lance Stroll with the ferocity of a man reclaiming his narrative, igniting a roar from the crowd that seemed to shake the grandstands. But beneath the surface of that surge, something deeply unsettling happened, something the average eye missed, and even some engineers likely dismissed at first. As he braked, the bias didn't remain fixed. It migrated mid-corner. But not through his thumb. Not through conscious correction. The car did it on its own. The adjustment wasn't an accident. It wasn't a glitch. It was an autonomous delta response, an invisible line of code buried in the control system that quietly decided Hamilton was no longer to be left unchecked. He had cleared traffic. He had entered clean air. He was, for the first time all race, no longer reactive, but assertive. Ferrari's software didn't reward this moment. It responded by regulating it. Not enhancing his potential, but restricting it. This wasn't racecraft support. This was algorithmic suppression disguised as safety protocol. And still, nothing on the radio. Not a whisper about tire longevity. Not a suggestion to delay the switch to slicks. No data relay telling him that the dry line was forming slower than projected. The decision to pit early? It wasn't collaboratively made. It wasn't a bold driver call embraced by the team. It was a dare. A trap masked as strategy. Hülkenberg hadn't boxed. The conditions weren't optimal. But they let him go out early, sent him out knowing the chances of failure were high. Not to prove he was right, but to confirm they were. They didn't seek victory together. They sought a lesson. A lesson in control. In who truly calls the shots. They didn't treat him like a champion. They treated him like a variable in a lab experiment, a case study in why deviations must be punished. Hamilton later admitted it, not with rage, but with a fatigue far more telling, that trust is the rarest fuel in Formula One. You spend years building it, brick by brick, lap by lap, and it vanishes in seconds when the culture shifts from belief to bureaucracy. This wasn't a race. Not for him. Not that day. It was something colder. More calculated. A disciplined drill dressed in red. A test not of speed, not even of courage, but of submission. Of how far one of the greatest drivers in history could be pushed, isolated, and left to fail silently while the system watched, measured, recorded. There was no breakdown in communication. The silence was the communication. The setup wasn't flawed. It was weaponized. And the decisions weren't miscalculations. They were permissions, granted with quiet precision, to let him learn, once and for all, that even legends are expected to obey. When Ferrari finally acknowledged, almost casually, that their GPS system had failed early in the race, the global reaction was surprisingly muted. A technical hiccup, people assumed. Just another blip in the chaos of motorsport. But behind that quiet admission hid a far more calculated and strategic reality. That failure, subtle and conveniently timed, quickly transformed from a technical drawback into a strategic cloak. They didn't just announce it, they weaponized it. Without GPS-based positional tracking, they argued, they were unable to accurately determine Lewis Hamilton's exact on-track location in relation to their cars. It sounded plausible, even reasonable. But it was only a partial truth, a version of reality tailored for damage control. Because even without GPS data, the race engineers still had access to sector times. Every split time across every lap was still coming in, painting a precise enough picture of Hamilton's pace and position relative to their own strategy. They knew enough. More than enough. They had the tools. They had the numbers. They had the situational awareness to make a better decision. A more justifiable one. A fairer one. But they didn't. Not because they were blind. But because they chose not to see. Because in that critical moment, the ambiguity became their ally. The lack of GPS became a convenient curtain to hide behind. They could shrug, feign confusion, and say with a straight face, "We didn't know where Lewis was." And that wasn't an admission. It was an evasion. A conscious dodge. Translated into plain language, we acted without taking responsibility, because the moment let us. Meanwhile, Nico Hülkenberg was out there in clean air, untouched by traffic, running a perfect temperature window on his tires, with a rhythm unbroken and a strategy that blossomed lap by lap. The overcut wasn't just effective, it was clinical. It was sharp, methodical, flawless. And yet, when Hamilton finally emerged from the pit lane, it wasn't just Hülkenberg he was behind. It was Charles Leclerc, too. Again. Once more, Ferrari had engineered their timing to box Lewis in, to trap him in track position, not by accident, not by miscalculation, but by design. Because in truth, the GPS failure hadn't robbed them of a podium opportunity. It had handed them a plausible excuse, a ready-made justification for a decision they had already internally accepted, perhaps even rehearsed. It didn't obstruct them, it liberated them. It gave them a fallback, a line to repeat to the press, to the fans, to themselves. We couldn't know. But they could. And they did. The television feed didn't show this. The commentators, caught up in their own pacing and storytelling arcs, moved on too quickly. Their narratives closed before the raw truth even had time to surface. By the time the data emerged, lap deltas, pit loss charts, sector breakdowns, it was too late. The broadcast had shaped the audience's perception, and the deeper truth was buried beneath replays and highlight reels. But the data, silent and uncompromising, remains. It tells a different story. A colder one. A story not filtered through PR or padded with post-race interviews. A story that doesn't care about reputations or excuses. One that cuts through narratives like a scalpel. The data reveals what Ferrari won't say out loud. They made a call. Not because they had to, but because they could. And they knew they'd be able to walk away from it without consequences. Because when the GPS went down, so did the accountability. And in the shadows of that gray area, a strategic decision was disguised as an honest mistake. Lap 46 wasn't just another racing moment, it was the breaking point, the exact second when something far deeper than just a driver missing the apex took hold. Lewis Hamilton ran wide, but what followed wasn't just frustration, it was a revelation, a raw unmasking of a system on the edge. Sky Sports aired the radio clip, but what millions heard was only part of the truth. "This car is so hard to drive. Snappy like crazy," he said, his voice taut with tension, worn from weeks of pretending everything was normal. But that wasn't the line that mattered. That wasn't the one that sent ripples through Maranello. Because what they didn't broadcast, the words that were swiftly cut from the feed, were the ones that mattered most. The ones that weren't angry, but surgical. Calm, cold, and deliberate. "We've got to stop this cycle. Next year starts now." This wasn't a rant. It wasn't a driver lashing out. It was a declaration. A pivot point. A manifesto in the middle of chaos. And it wasn't aimed at a car setup or a tire compound. It was a scalpel aimed directly at the culture that surrounded him. The invisible walls of political silence. The disconnection in the garage. The isolation in debriefs. The fear of speaking truth. The weight of expectation without the architecture of support. He wasn't just talking about the twitchiness of the rear axle. He was talking about everything that had festered in the dark since his arrival. Losing 3.2 seconds from a slide sounds like a simple racing mistake, a consequence of slicks on damp asphalt. But this wasn't about grip. This was structural. Foundational. It was about the widening gap between potential and execution. It was about a team sending its 7-time world champion into battle with broken armor and asking him to win with a smile. And instead of arms reaching out to catch him, came strategy calls that felt like riddles. Tires switched too early. Undercuts initiated too late. Language cloaked in optimism but hollow in intent. Theatrics masked as tactical brilliance. And all the while, Hamilton didn't just feel unsupported, he felt betrayed. When he said he was in no man's land, it wasn't metaphor. It wasn't poetic flair. It was a precise geographic truth. He wasn't floating. He was left behind. This wasn't strategic miscommunication. This wasn't bad luck. Ferrari didn't simply miss the moment, they orchestrated around it. Not in malice, but in image control. Because Hamilton climbing onto the podium in a race this turbulent, in conditions this chaotic, would have been a shift in narrative no PR department could reverse. It would have rewritten the pecking order in one soaked afternoon. It would have obliterated Alpine's illusions of progress. It would have laid bare the stagnation inside Aston Martin's garage. It would have said clearly and undeniably that Hamilton still had the fire, and that Ferrari, for all its ceremonial grandeur, still didn't know how to wield it. And that couldn't be allowed. Not now. Not in this part of the season. Not with the optics so delicate. So instead of letting the storm deliver its truth, they strangled the signal. They buried the moment beneath layers of convenient chaos. They turned a potential message into noise. And what could have been a statement, bold, defiant, era-defining, was reduced to radio-static and controlled narrative. Not because they feared defeat, but because they feared the clarity of what Hamilton could still achieve, even when every system around him seemed built to fail. Vasseur may have smiled in the post-race press conference, but that smile was anything but spontaneous. It was rehearsed, calculated, the kind of expression you are not when you're surprised, but when you're already several moves ahead in a game most people don't even know they're playing. He blamed the GPS, casually labeling it a case of blind strategy, as if the most technologically advanced team in Formula One had somehow closed its eyes and rolled the dice. But if you truly watched his face, really watched, you saw something far more unsettling than surprise or regret. You saw composure. You saw control. You saw a man who wasn't reacting, but managing. This wasn't a misstep. This was a narrative being sculpted in real time, a distraction with enough ambiguity to keep the wolves at bay. Back in Maranello, the truth was already unraveling before the final lap had even been completed. According to internal sources, people close enough to hear the unfiltered conversations but careful enough to speak only off the record, the postmortem began before the race even ended. One engineer, with exhaustion clinging to his voice, admitted that the call they made was never going to favor Hamilton. They knew it. They ran the simulations. They saw the deltas. They saw the compromises. And they pulled the trigger anyway. Not because they were convinced it would win the race, but because the numbers could be framed to justify the choice later. In essence, they chose the move that gave them plausible deniability. The data didn't make the decision. The politics did. What Vasseur did in that moment was not about lap times or tire degradation. It wasn't even about overtakes or undercuts. It was about shielding the upper ranks. About controlling the story before it became a scandal. He stepped forward, not as a strategist, but as a firewall. He took the blame just late enough to distort the timeline, to create a fog dense enough that by the time clarity returned, the urgency had passed. And in doing so, he did something far more insidious than accept responsibility. He injected doubt. Doubt in Hamilton's judgment. Doubt in his instinct. Doubt in whether his intuition, honed by 2 decades of racing excellence, could still be trusted. It's a textbook maneuver in high-level leadership. Create confusion, offer yourself as the compass, and make sure your version of the truth is the only one with traction. But the problem with controlled chaos is that sometimes it breeds memory. And Lewis Hamilton, for all his calm demeanor and press-friendly restraint, forgets nothing. He logs every pause on the radio, every strategy call delivered with hesitation, every moment he asks for clarity and is met with deafening silence. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't rage. He watches. He stores. He builds a case not in words, but in patience. At Silverstone, Hamilton didn't merely miss out on a podium finish. He gained something far more valuable: vision. A kind of brutal, clean vision that only comes when illusions finally shatter. He didn't leave that circuit defeated. He left determined. No long applause for the home fans. No camera-facing gratitude. No prolonged waves. Just a sentence, quiet enough that only a few caught it: "I know what I don't want in next year's car." That wasn't a suggestion. That wasn't analysis. That was a line in the sand. Over the course of those 52 laps, Lewis wasn't just navigating apexes and grip levels. He was cataloging. Every team radio call was a referendum. Every moment of silence, a signal. He saw who still fought for him and who had already retreated. He registered the shift from collaboration to compliance, from belief to protocol. And now, there is no going back. The SF-25 isn't his car. It might never have been. And he's beginning to understand that it might not even be a winning machine. It might just be a symbol. A political artifact built for agendas, not victories. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because from now on, nothing is neutral. Every session is layered with intent. Every setup decision becomes a negotiation. Every tire choice, a battle of wills. He is no longer just driving. He is declaring. He is testing the limits, not just of the machine, but of the people behind it. Every lap is a reminder that he is still here, still calculating, still aware. And while others play for points, he plays for position, in the room, in the structure, in the legacy. Because when trust breaks, what remains is leverage. And Hamilton, more than anyone, knows exactly how to use it. Lewis Hamilton will not merely ride along as a passive participant in 2026. He will not sit quietly and accept what is handed to him. He will shape that car with the hands of an architect, molding its DNA with precision, vision, and a deep understanding of what it truly takes to win. And this isn't happening because Ferrari decided to hand him total control. This is not the result of a ceremonial gesture, a symbolic passing of the torch. No. It's happening because Hamilton is taking control himself. He's not waiting for permission. He's seizing the very essence of Ferrari's future with calculated determination. And now, only one question truly lingers in the air, loaded with tension and unresolved power dynamics. Can Ferrari even handle a version of Hamilton that refuses to be contained, confined, or controlled? What's unfolding now isn't just a championship storyline. It's not simply about tire degradation, pit stop strategy, or qualifying pace. The real war isn't playing out under the floodlights or at the first corner of every Grand Prix. It's erupting behind the imposing gates of Maranello, in the quiet corridors where strategy meetings turn into battlegrounds of influence. It's in the tension-soaked silences between debriefs. It's behind the closed doors where engineers whisper doubts and team principals weigh loyalties. Every single race moving forward will no longer be just a contest for points. It will be a battle for control over the narrative, for dominance over internal politics, and for the right to steer the soul of Ferrari into the unknown future. This is a struggle of power versus tradition, of new blood versus old doctrine, of vision versus legacy. Hamilton is not just racing against rivals on the grid, he's racing against the culture of a team that has long protected its sacred customs. He is challenging the unspoken hierarchy. Every on-track maneuver is now a coded message. Every radio silence is louder than 1,000 words. Every cryptic comment, every subtle body language gesture in a press conference, every smile that doesn't reach the eyes, all of it now tells a story. There are no coincidences here. There is only strategy, subtext, and psychological warfare. We are witnessing the collision between two forces, Ferrari's age-old identity, and Hamilton's unshakable will to revolutionize it from within. And that brings us to the questions that now hang like storm clouds over this entire operation. Was Hamilton truly peeling back the layers and exposing the raw, unfiltered truth about the SF-25's flaws? Or was he executing a long game, planting seeds of doubt, reshaping public perception, turning every Ferrari misstep into ammunition for his takeover? Was Vasseurs' GPS explanation rooted in fact, or was it a carefully scripted narrative to shield the team from deeper embarrassment? And who, when it truly matters, understands the DNA of this machine better? The 7-time world champion with a legacy built on adaptation and insight, or the Monégasque prodigy who has grown with the car but may now be watching it slip from his grip? These aren't questions the official press releases will ever answer. These are the questions that lurk in the shadows, waiting for those who are done with the polished, sanitized, surgically edited version of Formula One that is sold to the masses. If you're tired of the PR statements, the forced smiles, the controlled interviews, and the carefully orchestrated illusion of harmony, then you already know where you need to be. Because here, right here, is where the real story unfolds. This is where we read between the lines. This is where silence shatters, and truth, raw and unfiltered, finally roars through the noise. The resistance isn't a slogan. It's a choice. It's a refusal to accept the surface version of reality. And it starts now.